Well, good morning, everybody. Time to begin our Bible class. I hope you're feeling pretty good after, maybe the turkey that you've eaten. Kind of quiet in here this morning. That's okay. So I want to start out by reading a scripture that I think is very appropriate for our class, looking at our Christian Apologetics and studying how we present our faith to others and those who either don't believe or even to those who do believe but don't have full knowledge about, the Bible being literal, how the Bible's supposed to be. Is it creative? Is it kind of using some creative literature? No, it's literal. But to be able to present that is what I think is so important. But in Romans, the Apostle Paul, I think, says it very well in Romans chapter 1, that in 1:19, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor God or give him thanks, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So God gave them up, it says in the next verse. You let them go into their own lust of their hearts. And I see that as really a rejection of the facts and the science that God has provided for us. The science that we can look around and we can study and we can show it, and it's always been there. Now, there's a whole other part where, we can look at all the creative things and know that there's a designer, there is a God, but to know his plan, well, we need to look at the Bible and to study more specifically. But this class is about how we prove and defend that there is the existence of a creative designer who we as Christians call God. So, they had an opportunity and it's out there. And I think that's what we're trying to do in these apologetics, is to say, here it is. Here is the evidence that's been out there that you cannot deny. So many wonderful things that we've done and gone over these classes, and they just continue to marvel. Dr. Todd Wood, we're going to look at again this morning. We saw him last Sunday morning. And today we're going to cover two videos back to back and then discover and discuss them because they're kind of short, so they'll fit in real nice and neat. And one of them is the idea of looking at the origin of flight. I think to me, flight is one of the most amazing things that we can do. I think all of us at some point in time have looked and thought we could fly or dreamed about flying. I don't know, maybe it's just me, that I'm the only one, but we have that dream of, flying, I think. And I think about how recent it has been, really, in mankind, that we've been flying. We've had birds. We've had birds forever, but when we look around and think about how long it took man to finally be able to fly and make something that can fly, that's pretty amazing. Now, if you're an evolutionist, you had billions and billions and billions of years to slowly, through all these different design changes that you call mutations, that we've already shown that mutations do not create something that's new. They just mutate what's already in existence, but that's the whole other classes we've done. Go watch those videos. So to me, I think the idea of flight, as well as then the differences, this is where we get challenged in another video. This is the first one we're going to watch, is the difference between humans and apes. And ape-like creatures. I like the way that they really title it more appropriate than what I just said, because it's that idea that we look so common. And it just reminded me of the argument, not really an argument, discussion I tried to ask my biology teacher at NMSU here, when she was talking about the whale's fin, and that was proof of evolution, because if you look at a whale's fin, it has all the bones, not all, but it has a very, very similar bone structure to that of an arm, a human arm. And I just asked the question. I said, well, if you had one designer and you designed something that really worked well, why not use it on other things? I mean, I think of that all the time. I build something, and sometimes that could be used very well in something completely different, but it works. So if that structure of a fin on a fish, why can't that structure then be used on multiple animals and creatures? Okay, well, I did pass the class, but I got this really, you're so wrong look whenever I received that. So we're going to watch this, and we'll do a little bit of discussion at the end of the class. I hope you enjoy them. Again, isgenesishistory.com is where you can find these, as well as on YouTube. I highly, highly suggest that you go and mark these and find them. The QR code that's going to come up on there will take you to their website. So let's go ahead and watch them.
These are really remarkable creatures. I mean, if you stand here and watch them long enough, they're fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. Oh, my.
They're big, yeah.
Oh, and look at those fangs.
Todd, this obviously brings us to the question, the similarities between humans and apes, and all the story we've all heard about how we descended from apes. And that has huge implications for Christianity, for the Genesis history, for a lot of things.
Absolutely. It's definitely a big hot topic in evangelical theology right now, is this question of, do we have to even bother claiming that we're all descended from Adam and Eve, or can we just get rid of them and just go with whatever evolutionary biology tells us is our history?
Is that the result of the pressure from science that is telling people, hey, no, it's all there, it's easy to see in the fossil record and all of that?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of disillusionment with past attempts at explaining these things. So the heat's on, and so what are we going to do with these? What do you do with a gorilla? Clearly very different from human beings, but at the same time, among the animals, gorillas, chimpanzees, there's nothing more similar to us than those two things.
There's remarkable similarities.
It is, yeah, it is remarkable.
But, I mean, in the papers just recently, there is a new discovery. There are new skulls. There is new evidence, supposedly, in the fossil record that links all of this.
Yeah.
What do you see there?
Absolutely. Well, I got some right here in my bag. Let's have a look.
Ooh, a skull.
So this guy is a Neanderthal skull from Gibraltar. And you can see, I mean, it's got the classic Neanderthal look to it. Very, very low forehead, so we have really tall foreheads. The face, the mid-face has been pulled out. So it's as if someone grabbed his nose and pulled it out. But at the same time, well, it looks very human. It's not anything like a gorilla skull. It's got attributes that make it very clearly, it's very similar to human beings, even though it has this weird forehead. So that's Neanderthal. You want to hold that one for me? Yeah. Okay. We have others that are very different.
Oh, yeah.
Now this one is Australopithecus africanus. This was found in 1947, and it's really different. So you can see really no forehead at all. It just slopes right back. Very, very small brain case. Muzzle sticks way out, so the face is sloped forward. And so you might be wondering, what in the world does this have to do with humans, right? I mean, it's so different. Well, the answer is right here. That feature is called the big hole. Foramen magnum is the Latin term, but it's the big hole. It's the place where the brain stem comes out. And the position of this foramen magnum tells us this thing walked around on two legs. It had its head mounted right on the top of its spine so that it could see where it was going. These guys have their brain stem comes out the back. So their foramen magnum is back here. That's because they're walking around on all fours, right? And so what do you do with this stuff? I mean, there's many more that we could show, many more pictures, many more skulls, and you can see looking at them together, there's a lot of difference there.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. So all that created kind stuff that we already talked about with the horses and the cats and the meerkats and how they're different, Archaeopteryx, I can do the same sorts of things with humans. And this is where it gets really cool. Because I can show again and again and again with multiple studies that I can find a discontinuity between humans and non-humans. So this thing lands on the human side. This Neanderthal here, it's one of us. This thing is not. It is different, and I can tell you that it's different. I can diagnose it, I can do the statistics, and I can show you with a great deal of certainty this is not human. Now, if evolution were true, you might think there wouldn't be any way to do that there should be a gradual continuum from ape to human, and so there wouldn't be any place to draw that line. But even after all of these discoveries, that's what makes it so cool. Even after Australopithecus africanus and all these other things that we have from the fossil record, I can still easily draw a line between things that are human and things that are not.
So when we look at Neanderthal man, we're looking at a human, but it's a human that, just like we find in dogs, we have a lot of variety of dogs.
We got a lot of variety of people.
So we're talking about a human that might be a dachshund or a Great Dane.
Sure.
And so how then do we think about a creature that obviously was walking upright? Just a different kind of creature, a different kind?
It's a different kind of creature. Some of my studies kind of indicated this might be related to chimpanzees, but I don't know that for sure. That's not really settled. But this would be just another one of those varieties of living things that God made in the beginning and that survived the flood aboard the ark.
Do chimpanzees have that same spinal?
No. They have one much like the gorillas that comes out at the back. So that's a very different feature, which is why this might not be anything to do with chimpanzees. That's still sort of uncertain. The thing that I'm really sure about is the line between this human and this non-human.
And this human and those gorillas?
Non-humans, exactly. Very easy to draw those lines. So even looking back here at the gorilla, we can see the obvious differences between us and him, not the least of which is that he's in there and we can go home when we're done. But as we've been sitting here talking about this, that gorilla has vomited multiple times and eaten it again, which is not a typical human behavior. He doesn't seem to learn that if he would stop eating his own vomit, he would probably stop vomiting. He's got that big brow ridge, which is very much a characteristic like this Australopithecus. Big canine teeth, which we don't have. His arms are much, much longer than his legs, which is a characteristic of a creature that would walk around on all fours instead of upright like we do. So there's a really big gap between humans and gorillas. Even though genetically, he is quite similar. Now, speaking of genetics, we also have Neanderthal genome data that can show us that you and I, right here, we have Neanderthal genes in our own genomes because our ancestors intermarried with the Neanderthals. Now, if you think that Neanderthal is just an animal, that's really hard to explain. You know, how do you get human-animal hybrids? What does that mean for the soul? What does that mean for theology? But if they're just another human, Neanderthal breeding with people, that's not really that big a deal. Because that's exactly what we would expect people to do when they spread out and encounter other people. They intermarry. And that's exactly what we had with the Neanderthals.
Todd, when we read about these discoveries, and no doubt there's going to be the next one will come out in a newspaper soon, how does the average person read that and understand? Are we talking about a human kind, or are we talking about another kind?
Now, having studied these issues for years that I've worked on this problem, I'm really confident that whatever the next one is, it's going to fall either into the ape camp or in the human camp. I don't think it's as easy as just, you know, reading a magazine or looking at a picture and being able to say, oh yeah, that's human, no, yeah, that's not. I think there's a lot more variety of human out there than what we have really been thinking about. Kind of like with cats and all the other created kinds. We've had a very limited idea of the sorts of varieties there are. So yeah, don't panic, be patient, let science do its thing, let creation science do its thing, and hopefully we'll be able to give a pretty timely update on what is or isn't human.
Todd, what are some of those similarities that we would find between the human and the ape and the chimpanzee?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. For example, these apes don't have any tails, much like we don't have any tails. When we look down at the genetic level, we find even more similarity. We find startling similarity. So the question is, what do we do with that? And sort of on the one hand, we could say, well, that's because there's a common designer, right? There is one God that made us all, so it makes sense that there would be similarity. Ultimately, I find that a little dissatisfying because there's clearly a pattern here, right? So I'm more similar to you than I am to this ape, but I'm more similar to that gorilla than I am to the lions we already saw. So there's clearly a pattern here that needs to be explained, and it needs to be more than just saying, oh, well, God made it that way. It's not terribly satisfying. So that's one of those research areas that we're still working on in creationism that I think is going to yield a lot of great fruit in the near future.
And those are those areas that we need more research.
Yes, those are the areas we need more
scientists.
research, more scientists, more students interested, more students involved. That's exactly what we need.
Yeah. Well, even though there are similarities, it's obvious that there is something radically different about this creature called man.
Yeah.
That we would understand is made in the image of God.
Right.
And so those differences are really huge, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the image of God entails this idea of being God's representative here on this earth. And part of that then is having dominion and having authority. And these guys don't have that, whereas we definitely do. But we also see in the fossil record a lot of variation, right? So it's not always that you can just look at something and say, well, there's the image of God. Sometimes the image of God can surprise you in forms that aren't quite so familiar as you and I might think of as being the image of God. So that just reminds us that the image of God is not something that you can sort of pin down. It's this trait or that trait. The image of God is a spiritual quality that we have that we don't share with animals like that.
The whole issue of flight and birds. It's just amazing to me to see them just so effortlessly, to be able to just take off, glide, land. We go through a lot of stuff to try to get mechanical things to fly, and the beauty associated with it as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you can see a number of different forms there. There's a lot of doves in here. They're a member of a single created kind.
And the one with a really long tail.
Oh yeah, the really long tail. Definitely a mating display. That is very attractive to female birds.
Oh, is that right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Well, Todd, here's the question, because I've been involved with flight, and it's a complex thing. I mean, it's not an easy thing. When we try to take some mechanical thing, you have to have an aerodynamic structure, you have to have a propulsion system, you have to have really light wings, control surfaces, all of those things, and it took us a long time before we could just get one up, and yet we see these creatures, very different creatures that have that capability.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you see that as a biologist?
It's amazing. And it's not just birds. So if you're thinking of this in sort of evolutionary terms, you'd have amazing attributes like this you would think would have a single origin, but this one has at least 4 origins. At least 4. So we see powered flight in birds. We see it in bats, which are mammals. We see it in pterodactyls, which are birds or mammals. We see it in insects. You've got at least 4 times that powered flight originated. And then you've got all the gliders, you know, the flying squirrels, the flying frogs, the flying fish, all those things that just sort of glide. They still have the aerodynamics, they just can't keep themselves up. And for me, I'm thinking, you know, this is a lot easier to explain if God created the flying things, and that's where flight came from. I don't have to worry about getting all my ailerons right and all my aerodynamic things and make sure my wing angles are correct. We don't have to think about that more than 4 or 5 or however many times in evolution, because we just have one origin of flying things on day 5 of creation. It seems to me a lot simpler way of explaining things.
So we obviously have a radical difference here between these two paradigms when it comes to the issue of flight.
Yeah.
So the conventional paradigm, that ability to fly is still coming out of that one trunk, isn't it?
It's got to evolve somehow, yeah. And so it's going to evolve multiple times. It'll evolve in the bats, it has to evolve in the birds. With the creation model, you just have one origin of flight because God designed things to fly. All of those complex attributes that all have to be right, well, that's because God made them all that way just to be right. So when we look around, we would expect to see possibly multiple created kinds of birds, and that's exactly what we see. So we've seen here, we've got these dwarf geese and this teal, which is kind of like a duck. That's a single created kind. We've got a number of doves in here.
Oh, just flew through.
That was awesome. A number of doves in here those are also members of a single created kind. So there's diversity once you have the ability to fly, but the ability to fly isn't the thing that's being generated during that process. It is a unique designed feature of these creatures.
So the conventional paradigm would have to somehow come up with the flight characteristics in various places to bring them to where they are.
Yeah, and it's got to get all of them, right? So it's got to have it's got to be light, it's got to have a big wing surface, it's got to have some kind of flapping ability.
Sure.
All that sort of thing has to be all in place before they can start flying. Now they might, and the hypothesis is, you know, they start on trees and they jump off and they start as gliders, and then they learn how to flap their wings and then keep themselves up off the ground. But yeah, flight's a complicated thing. It's an amazing
And even
thing.
when you look at an insect, radically different, of course, from a bird, I've often thought just how complex a mosquito is, that he has the ability to fly and land, to detect its target, to recognize a threat. All of that built in a tiny little creature.
A tiny little creature that barely has a brain, right?
Barely has a brain.
And somehow it can do all those things and still fly.
Todd, do we have evidence in the fossil record that helps us understand any of this, or does it make it more complicated?
Well, that's a good question. So I got one right here. I got a model of a very famous fossil. This is Archaeopteryx, right?
Yeah, you've seen it.
So this, yeah, of course you have. This is from the British Museum, or the original is in the British Museum. Beautiful fossil. It's got beautiful flight feathers on both wings. You can see the beautiful flight feathers on the tail. But you can also see up here on the wings it has claws, which is not something that we have in modern birds. Modern birds don't have claws on their wings. We also see there's a long bony tail, which is also another attribute that's absent in modern birds. They have little stumpy tails. And when you look up really close, you'll see the mouth is full of teeth, which is not something that we see in modern birds. So in fact, in that respect, this thing is more similar to dinosaurs than it is to modern birds.
But is it a dinosaur?
That's the question, right? So the conventional model would say this is the transitional form, or close to it, that leads to birds. Now, I've looked at this myself, several different studies on this that have been published, and I can tell you this isn't like mesohippus, that horse thing that we could say this is part of the horse kind. This is one of those intermediate forms that has traits of two different created kinds, but it's its own created kind. It's its own separate group. So now we can wonder about, well, why does it have these traits of more than one created kind? But it's not really a transition. It's separate from dinosaurs, and it's separate from birds. It's different from both. It's its own thing. So it's not really what we would think of as a transition, right? There was never a transition there, so it's not a transition. We'd have to call this an intermediate, which is why I like that word intermediate better than I like transitional. Because I don't have to imply there was a transition. This is a form of mosaic. That's the term we use for a creature that has different traits from different created kinds. This, however, is its own unique created kind. So that's Archaeopteryx.
And it obviously has, I mean, I can see here, I mean, these are beautiful feathers that were on this creature.
Yeah, we've got multiple fossils of Archaeopteryx showing the feathers. And they all got those claws on their wings, and they do have those beautiful flight feathers, very clearly shaped for flying. Now, whether this thing actually flew or not, it might be a glider, we don't really know, because, you know, it's dead. But it definitely has those fascinating combination of traits in its own unique created kind.
Todd, are there any creatures alive today that we would look at and say that's a mosaic?
Sure. Duck-billed platypus, right?
Oh, yeah.
So duck-billed platypus got that beak like a bird. It's got fur like a mammal. Makes venom like a snake. It's got all these weird traits all sort of jumbled together into a single critter, which makes it a mosaic, much like Archaeopteryx here is a mosaic. So yeah, they're alive now.
So people might look at the duck-billed platypus today and say that's a transitional form.
Sort of. The way they would phrase it is a stem mammal.
Okay.
And the stem mammal would mean on the stem that leads to mammals, this is a side branch. So they wouldn't necessarily say it's the actual transition. There's other things they would use for that. But it's definitely sort of representative of the base of the mammal tree. But, you know, from a creationist perspective, it is its own unique created kind. And I can show that again with our analyses. So for me, it's better understood as a mosaic. And the better question is, why does it have traits from multiple created kinds, since it's not really a stem mammal and it's not really a transitional form?
And so that question is, how does it have all of those traits?
And the answer is, I don't know. I wish I
And
did.
that's good. Is it a research topic
Yeah,
for
it's
one
a
of our...
great research topic for the next generation. I've been working on those for years, but I've not gotten a good answer.
Well, we need some students to come along and do that.
So, what do you think? I come back to the scripture I read. I think that, the struggle is to completely, for the evolutionists, is to completely remove the idea that there's design, that there's no design, that it's haphazard. Somehow it all happened in the billions of years, that everything was just finally, and that through natural selection, somehow there's this force or something that even within natural selection that's determining what is a good change from a bad change. And that's information. To me, that's information. And so where's that information stored? How is it then projected forward in the reproduction and the continuation of life forms as they start to develop? And knowing that this is a good change because we want to get you as a fish. I'm Mr. Natural Selection here. And I want to get you as a fish up on top of that land. So I have to get you through all these different evolutionary changes and selecting out and bringing forward good ones and removing bad ones. So there's a lot of challenges, I think, for the evolutionists to really just flat say that there's no designer and that there's no God. And we, again, Christians, we call him God. We have no problem with that. And he is our designer. He's designed all these things. And he has even stated that in the Bible in the way that he talks about that the evidences are in front of us always. But it's how you approach it. Do you really want to know what is the truth? Or are you trying to build things around and information to support something you want to believe? I want to believe that there is just no God. It just happened, and so it's just an accident. And to me, that's where, for the evolutionist, takes faith. You're trying to take information and trying to hope something that is really not it's not provable. And you look at the creationists, and yet the evolutionists tear into creationists and say, well, that's just ridiculous. There cannot be a God. Well, you've got as much mystery, I think, in the evolution as we can say, really, there isn't that mystery because the Bible has explained it to us, and we can look around in this world and we can see how that God has created all of these things, that there is one designer. So that's all I have for the class. I hope that you will join us at worship at 10:45. 4 o'clock, we have worship again. And also Wednesday, I'm back. So I'll be here Wednesday evening. We're continuing to look at the life of David. And then our podcast on Friday. So hope to see you soon.